great for reproducing power on an industrial scale, but it is not musical sounding for a guitar player. It just is. That's just the facts.
We're going to talk about power amps a little bit, in particular solid state Class D power amps. Steve Fryette does in one of his Malcontents videos. There's so much material there that it's easy to miss these nuggets, and this in particular is something I felt about Class D power amps for a long time. Never really could explain why. He explains the science behind it, and while the science is a little above me, some of the stuff he says is dumbed down enough for my guitar player brain to understand it, and it explained the Class D phenomenon that I've experienced for a long time. Just a quick explanation of what I'm talking about. It goes back to several years ago. I built a rack just for fun. It was a guitar gear nerd project just to entertain me, and I wanted to be able to learn to use MIDI and stuff like that. So long story short, it was super fun, and I got really good sounds in my bedroom. The sound amplification component was just a Crown solid state Class D power amp. With its transparency, and I knew I was getting sounds I liked, I figured if I ran the Class D power amp into one of my cabs with a speaker that I liked, I thought, hey, I've made this rig. It's cheap and it's flexible. I got 4,000 MIDI presets, and you know, it was a lot of fun. Then I experienced something we've all probably experienced at different times with different setups and pieces of gear. I took my rack of misfit toys, and with all the confidence of what I was getting in my bedroom, I took it to jam with a buddy. It was just a guitar jam, so we weren't playing with a drummer or anything, not super loud, even though the Class D power amp could get really loud. And here's where the problem's identified. As I jam with my buddy who's playing a tube amp, my rack sounds are anemic. Shamefully anemic. Here's the funny part. You know what amp my rack was getting mogged by? A Blues Junior. A Blues Junior sounded like Yngwie's Wall of Marshalls compared to my anemic solid state Class D powered rack. Trying different things during that time, like even running a tube preamp into the solid state Class D power amp, it really identified that power amp as being the problem I was experiencing. Something was missing, and that's the best way I could articulate it. Well, lucky for me, there's geniuses like Steve Fryette, and during one of his Malcontents episodes, he talks during part of it, I think it's like 2 or 3 hours long, specifically about Class D power amps, what they do, and it was an aha moment for me. It gave me a scientific explanation from somebody who knows all this stuff, what I was experiencing, hearing, feeling, why my Class D power amp got mogged by a Blues Junior. I did want to throw in something I noticed when I was putting this video together. I have nothing against Blues Juniors. I mean, it's a tube amp, and I think they're kind of underrated, actually. I think they get a bad rap, you know, maybe because of the build quality or some of the natural things that are subject to go wrong. But as far as how they sound, especially clean with pedals, I have zero complaints. Blues Junior, perfectly good amp. Blues Junior with a speaker swap, now we're talking. So let's watch what Steve had to say. I'm going to link his full video in the description. And that channel is full of just golden information. Some of it's beyond me. Steve's kind of a amp genius type, but he makes awesome stuff, and there's a lot of great information on the channel. So without further ado, let's watch some YouTube together.
Now, Class D. Let's just talk about Class D really quickly. Imagine a sine wave. And if we all know what a sine wave looks like, imagine a camel, the hump on the camel's back. Now take a camel and then put another camel right after it, but upside down. You have one camel, the hump is going up, the other camel, the hump is going down. That's a sine wave. And that's sine wave represents a frequency. And a guitar chord is composed of multiple frequencies overlapped on top of each other. And that's what audio is.
Yeah.
I've seen sine waves and oscilloscopes used by people that know what they're doing, you know, diagnosing amps or electronic equipment and stuff like that. And, you know, you hear, okay, this fuzz has a square wave and stuff like that. So outside of that, I'm out of my element, but loosely knowing, yes, this is something I've heard before is where I'm coming from at this point.
So a tube amplifier takes a little sine wave or a combination of a bunch of overlapping sine waves and makes that a bigger, louder result of all those combined sine waves, along with some of the oddball little behavior in tube amplifiers that we love, along with some of the oddball behavior in a guitar speaker in a cabinet, which we love. And then when you hit that speaker with that voltage, some of this voltage from the speaker leaks back into the amplifier because it's a tube amplifier, and a solid state amplifier will prevent that from happening. So you can't have that. Sorry, in a solid state amp, you can't have that part. You can't have that because tube amplifier does that, but the solid state amplifier will not allow that. Sorry.
So the explanation of tube amps, pretty simple. Even I can understand. You've got small sine waves, small sound, small audio. Tube amp makes it big, introduces some perhaps distortion, harmonics, stuff like that that aren't necessarily intended with the audio type function, but as tube amps have become something guitar players know, love, and use, there's elements of that we associate with a good sounding amp. Apparently the feedback from the speaker is something a solid state amp can't do, which I'm not sure how much that matters, but I'm with Steve on this explanation. It's not above me.
Anybody using and selling a Class D power amp will tell you it's analog. It is. An analog signal went in, an analog signal comes out. There's no D to A converter going in. There's no A to D converter coming back out. It doesn't convert the signal into digital information and then back into analog information. It doesn't do that.
So Class D power is analog. I once had a friend who is definitely not me that thought the D standard for digital. I would never do that.
What it does do is it takes a sine wave and changes it into a triangle wave and then into a square wave. And they do that because transistors and tubes use energy when they're making the transition from 0 to full power. This sine wave that we're talking about, you notice it has an angle going up and an angle going down. When the signal is at its full output, at its maximum clean power output, it's using a certain amount of energy. In a Class D amplifier, it's using about the same amount of energy. But when there's no signal happening, Class D amplifier, immediately switches to using 0 energy, where a power tube transitions to using 50% as much energy. Full power, no power, tube power amp. Class D, full power, no power.
And see, we're already talking about changing waves when the audio goes into the Class D power amp. I mean, we've already had 2 conversions. Your sine wave goes in and it changes into a square wave. That's already introducing an audio element that I can't think is for the best as far as putting my pure signal out the way I want it into a Class D power amp when you're totally having to change the waveform. Again, I scientifically don't know what exactly that entails, but the guitar player in me just says, hey, whoa, we're already doing a lot of messing around with my precious tones here.
That 50% difference is where all the efficiency in the power amplifier comes from. The transistor doesn't transition from full power output to 0 power output. It instantly switches from on to off because the signal was converted to a square wave. Well, a square wave just sounds like a fuzz face. Why do I want that?
That's not guitaristically.
Here's the trick.
desirable.
The trick is that square wave switches from positive to negative every millionth of a cycle, or every 300,000th of a cycle, whatever frequency the Class D power amp is operating at. Let's just call it a megahertz. If it's a megahertz, the square wave polarity is switching at 1 millionth of a cycle every millionth of a second. And the transistor is either 100% on or 100% off. No transition period. That 0 transition period means it's not using energy transitioning from on to off. It's only using energy when it's on full and no energy when it's off. So that quickly switching square wave is then amplified into the larger power, and then all of the square wave component is filtered out at the end so that it resembles, not equals, resembles a sine wave again.
Yeah. It's a facsimile of the
It's a facsimile of the sine wave. It's not the sine wave.
That description of what's happening to my guitar signal does not inspire confidence that it will produce a good result. Thanks to Steve Fryette for such a knowledgeable take explaining all this. But now I'm hearing there's a square wave that is switching from positive to negative millions of times, like every millionth of a second, I think he said, depending upon whatever parameters you're working in. But either way, what the heck? Your signal goes into the Class D power amp and does these ridiculous electronic gymnastics, I guess, to allow the amp to function as intended. And then, by the way, before it outputs, it's run through a filter or a filtering system so it can hopefully resemble what went into it in some way. Really, listening to all that explains why a signal that is good, that has, the cojones you want and all that, surely it loses some of the finer points at the very least of your harmonic content and just the things maybe we feel and don't even hear. You have to think the subtleties are gone first, but with all of that going on, it's amazing that it sounds anything like what went into it to begin with. That makes sense if I'm playing a nice thick lead tone that is dialed in and sounds good. When I put it up against even a smaller tube amp like a Blues Junior, it's neutered of all of those things that really make it. That would explain why my signal in that particular scenario just sounded really lacking. It sounded like the manhood of the signal was stripped away when placed up against a normal tube amp, which has all manhood included.
If you look at it very closely, you'll see that that sine wave is chopped into 1,000,000 bits or 300,000 bits. And so there's this sort of choppiness to it. That choppiness is not musical sounding, number one. It cannot be completely eliminated without elaborate filtering. And if you do use really elaborate filtering, the filtering will cause, this is really deep now, phase shift, which will happen at frequencies that you don't hear but give you a fucking headache.
That's wild.
And anybody that's used a low-cost class D power amp for a whole gig and then goes home with a giant migraine, that's why. Your brain doesn't like that. Your brain does not like that. Your brain, you get a headache because your brain worked really hard the whole night of that gig trying to filter out that nasty Class D chopping behavior. And then the other thing about solid state power amps, whether they're Class D or Class AB, is they require a really stiff, pure, clean power supply in order to operate properly. There's no slop, there's no sag, there's no nothing. They're very tightly regulated, they're highly filtered, they don't move. And anybody that has laid into any kind of a medium-sized amplifier or even a loud amplifier at very loud volume, and you pound on a chord, you hear that sag and then that breathing open. No solid-state power amp does that.
As if what we already talked about wasn't enough of a turnoff for using a Class D power amp, now there's phase issues introduced, which phase is scary to me anyway. Like anytime I think about using two microphones, I'm like, I don't know. Just hearing that there's these ninja phase issues that you can't even hear, but are also sonically weaponized to give you a headache, as Steve said. I'm out. I'm out on the Class D. That's enough. But we still have a problem. And this is one of those things like, you know, if a tree falls in the forest and no one's there to hear it type of a problem. So you get your tube amp, you get it dialed in for the venue, which there's endless variables there on whether or not you can even sound good at all, even under the best of circumstances. And you make buddies with the sound man so he doesn't jack you up, or hopefully he's a good sound man running the front of the house. But then I have to either mic my cabinet or use some other direct option that's going to feed my precious tube setup into the front of house. The majority of my sound that's going to be created, because, you know, I'm going to be playing large venues. You know, that's the type of crowd that would come and see what I do. There won't be any women in the crowd. It'll be a bunch of guys with their arms crossed, but it'll be large. I'm joking, of course, but the point is you mic your cabinet, go through a power station, a load box, however you're getting your tube signal to the front of house, to the PA, and then it gets amplified by Class D power amps. So this is when I'm forced to ask myself, does any of this matter in the end anyway? I think your best bet, your only bet, is to use whatever is A, convenient enough where you can get it to wherever you're playing, and B, it sounds good enough where you're inspired by it and you can perform at whatever level is the best you can perform under whatever the circumstances are. I don't know that some of the minutia is really going to matter in the end, so use what you like best and what you sound best with. So that's it for this edition of Guitar Vacation. You know, I do the really popular subjects that are going to get tons and tons of views, like obscure power amp talk about waves flipping and transitioning. You know, there's a huge audience for that. All joking aside, anybody that watches some of my videos are part of the group of us that we really do get into that depth and get in the weeds, and we just love it that much. We're gear nerds, we're guitar nerds, and it's a fun part of being a guitar player if you're into it at that level. So on the subject of fun, I want you to take yourself a guitar vacation and play some stuff that's fun. That's what I'm going to be doing, in addition to a bunch of practice that's kind of fun sometimes, kind of not, but we all need to do both. We'll holler at you soon. Later.